Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about millennials.
Okay.
And you know how there's this whole thing going around about them being like super sensitive and anxious,
Mm.
like they can't handle anything?
Right. The whole generation wuss idea.
Yeah,
That
exactly. Like they're just not cut out for the real world or something.
it's a pretty common narrative you hear a lot.
But what if that's not really true?
Well, that's what we're going to explore today. We're going to see if maybe millennials are a lot tougher than we give them credit for.
Exactly. We're going to really deep dive into this idea.
I love it.
Our main source for this deep dive is this really interesting NPR article. It's called, "Is the Resilience of Millennials Underrated?"
Ooh, that's a good question.
And the thing is, it brings up some really surprising points.
Yeah.
Like, did you know that all that talk about millennials having way more depression, it's not actually backed up by the data?
Oh, really? So you're saying like the rates of depression haven't actually gone up that much?
Yeah, that's what the article says.
Yeah.
Pretty interesting, right?
Yeah. That is interesting. It seems like everyone's always talking about how millennials are like the most depressed generation ever.
Right. But then you look at the research and it's like, maybe not so much.
So then what's going on? Why do we have this impression that millennials are struggling so much more?
Well, that's a really good question. And the article kind of touches on this idea that millennials are just way more open about their struggles.
Makes sense. They're the social media generation, right?
Exactly. They grew up sharing everything online.
So maybe they're not necessarily more anxious. They're just more vocal about it.
It's like everyone's always posting about their therapy and their anxiety and all that.
Yeah, and it creates this kind of echo chamber where it seems like everyone's struggling.
And then there's the whole economic thing, too.
Hmm.
You know, millennials are dealing with like crazy student loan debt, a tough job market. The cost of living is insane.
Right. All those things definitely add to the stress.
It got to be tough graduating with like a mountain of debt and then trying to find a job that actually pays the bills.
Yeah, I can see how that would make anyone anxious.
But even with all that stress, it's important to remember that stress and like clinical depression are not the same thing.
That's a good point. Just because you're stressed out doesn't mean you're clinically depressed.
Exactly. And the article actually points out something really interesting about suicide rates.
What's that?
So while suicide rates have gone up for some older age groups, they've actually been going down for young people since like the late 90s.
Huh. That's pretty surprising. I would have thought it would be the opposite.
Me too. But the data is pretty clear on that.
So it seems like the whole Generation Wuss thing might not be the whole story.
Yeah, it's definitely more complicated than that.
Mm-hmm.
And to really understand millennial resilience, I think we have to look beyond just the data.
What else do we need to consider?
Well, there's this one perspective the article highlights. It's kind of thought-provoking.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So it basically argues that maybe millennials are actually less resilient because of overprotective parenting.
Oh, wow. You mean like they were sheltered too much and now they can't handle real life?
Yeah, that's the basic idea. It's kind of a controversial theory, but it's worth considering.
It makes sense in a way. Like, if you never have to deal with any challenges growing up, then maybe you're not as prepared for the real world.
Right. And this psychologist named Joseph Allen is kind of the main proponent of this theory.
Interesting. But the article also mentioned that there's not a ton of research to support this idea yet, right?
Yeah, it's more of a hypothesis at this point. It definitely needs more investigation.
So it's something to keep in mind, but we shouldn't jump to conclusions.
Exactly. We have to be careful about making generalizations based on limited evidence.
Always a good reminder.
So where do we go from here? If the data doesn't fully support the Generation Wuss label, what does it tell us about millennial resilience?
I guess that's the big question. And to really get into that, I think we need to dive a little deeper.
Sounds like a plan. Let's continue this deep dive in the next part.
Looking forward to it. So you know how millennials get criticized all the time for being fragile?
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing. They're actually the ones who are like making it okay to talk about mental health.
You mean like going to therapy and stuff?
Exactly. They're way more open about it than previous generations.
That's true. I've noticed that too.
Like they'll talk about their anxiety or depression or whatever.
It's like they're not afraid to say, hey, I'm struggling.
Right. And they're not afraid to seek help either. They're more likely to go to therapy or talk to a doctor.
Which is a good thing, right?
Definitely. It takes courage to admit you need help.
So if we're not going with the Generation Wuss thing, then how do we describe millennials and their mental health?
I think you have to remember that they're dealing with a totally different world than previous generations.
Like, what do you mean?
Well, there's social media, for one thing. That's a whole new level of pressure.
Yeah, it's like you're constantly comparing yourself to everyone else.
And then there's the whole gig economy thing. It's harder to find stable jobs.
And the cost of living is just ridiculous.
All those things add up. It's no wonder they're stressed.
Plus, there's climate change looming over everything.
Oh, yeah. Climate anxiety is a real thing.
Wow. I hadn't even thought about that.
It's a huge source of stress for millennials and Gen Z.
Makes sense. It's like they're inheriting a world that's kind of messed up.
In a lot of ways, yeah. But even with all that, they're finding ways to cope.
They're a resourceful bunch.
They're embracing new technologies, creating new ways of working, and building communities online and offline.
So they're adapting to this new reality.
Exactly. And that's what resilience is all about. It's not about being tough. It's about being able to bounce back.
To adjust to whatever life throws at you.
Right. To find meaning and purpose even when things are hard.
So in a way, millennials are kind of pioneers.
How so?
Well, they're navigating this whole new world of mental health, and they're figuring it out as they go.
They're challenging the old ways of thinking about mental health.
And they're showing us that it's okay to be vulnerable.
To ask for help when you need it.
I think there's a lot we can learn from them.
I agree. They're teaching us to be more human.
It's been really eye-opening talking about this.
It's always good to challenge our assumptions.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave everyone with something to think about.
Okay.
If we accept that millennials are actually pretty resilient, how does that change how we see them?
That's a good one.
Like, do we start seeing them as more valuable to society?
Instead of just complaining all the time?
Right. It's something to consider.
Definitely food for thought.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into millennial resilience. We'll catch you next time. All right, so as we wrap up this deep dive on millennial resilience, let's kind of like recap what we've talked about.
Yeah, good idea.
You know, we started out talking about this whole Generation WIS thing.
Right, that whole stereotype.
But then we looked at the data and it was like, wait a minute. That's not really the whole story.
The data was pretty surprising, actually.
And it seems like millennials are actually dealing with a lot of unique challenges that previous generations didn't have to face.
Like social media, the gig economy, all that stuff.
Exactly. And yet they're finding ways to adapt and thrive.
They're pretty resourceful when you think about it.
They are. And they're also like changing the conversation around mental health.
Which is huge.
It's like they're not afraid to talk about their struggles and ask for help.
And that's a good thing, right?
Absolutely. It's breaking down the stigma.
So maybe instead of Generation WUS, we should be calling them like Generation Open or something.
Uh-huh. I like that.
But seriously, I think there's a lot we can learn from millennials.
Me too.
Yeah.
They're showing us that it's okay to be vulnerable.
And to prioritize mental health.
So before we go, I want to leave you with one last thought.
Hit me with it.
If millennials are actually this resilient generation, how does that change the way we see them and their role in society?
That's a really interesting question.
It's something to think about.
Definitely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone.
It's been a great conversation.
Until next time, keep those mental gears turning.
And don't forget to challenge those assumptions